Welcome back to Tightwad Workshop. Today we're going to be working on another Repair Cafe overflow job, this kid's bicycle. Now normally I try to finish these jobs at the Repair Cafe, but even though I take a lot of tools and spare parts along with me, there's a limit to how much stuff I can carry, and this one had a fault that needed to come back to the workshop to fix it. So the young lady that owns this bike is very anxious to have it back and available on the road, so let's get to it and see if we can put a smile on her face. I'll start by flipping the bike upside down. That tinkling noise in the frame is a symptom of one of this bike's faults. Now we can loosen this screw and remove the chain guard. This is made a little bit easier if you rotate the pedals to this position. Now the bike's most obvious fault is a dead flat rear tyre, but this side-to-side movement in the crank is a more serious issue. We'll need to deal with both of these problems, so I'll start by removing the rear wheel. We'll first need to loosen both of the axle nuts, then we need to remove the bolt from the brake arm. This arm is what the rear brake mechanism levers against when you apply the brake. I'll just move the clip forwards out of the way. Then we can push the wheel all the way forwards and take the chain off the wheel sprocket. The wheel now slides backwards out of the bike frame. I'll turn the bike around for the next step. The crank has come loose somehow, and we'll need to remove it to fix the problem. Our first step is to remove this pedal. This pedal's on the left side of the bike, so it uses a left-handed thread and has to be removed in this direction. Now we need to remove the crank's lock nut. This is also a left-handed thread, so once again we unscrew it this way. Now we can remove the anti-spin washer. It has a small lug here that engages with this slot in the crank to prevent it from turning. And finally, we can unscrew the bearing cone from the crank. Just like all the other parts on this side of the crank, this also has a left-handed thread. Once we've unscrewed the bearing cone, it'll lift straight off the crank arm. That's not quite totally dry, but I really do prefer to see a bit more grease than that inside a bearing. Next I'll remove the chain from the crank's sprocket, and then we'll take the bearing off the crank. This bearing is in pretty good condition, so the problem must be on the other side. Now we can carefully remove the crank assembly from the frame. This bearing looks much less healthy. The camera focus didn't want to cooperate with me, but you can see that it's missing 3 ball bearings from the carrier. I did hear at least one ball bearing rattling around inside the frame before, so let's see if we can retrieve it. It's hard to believe, but all 3 of those missing ball bearings were still trapped inside the frame. Also, my pliers have become magnetised somehow. So this is our good bearing, and this is the damaged one. These sheet metal bearing carriers are basically used to make it easier to install and remove the bearings, and also so that you only need 7 ball bearings on each side, rather than 14. This one isn't badly damaged, so we'll bend it back into shape with some needle nose pliers. We just need it to bend enough so that it'll hold onto the ball bearings, but still be loose enough for the bearings to be able to rotate freely. Now we'll grease the bearings before we reassemble the crank. I'm using the same high temperature bearing grease that I used for my trailer bearings last year. Lily's unlikely to ride this bike hard enough to need the high temperature feature, but it's what I have on hand. I'm just working some grease into each bearing retainer so that each ball bearing is fully coated. Once the bearings are greased, we'll also put some grease on each of the bearing cups in the bicycle frame. These don't need a lot of grease, but they definitely shouldn't have been as dry as they were. Now I'll fit the good bearing onto the crank. I'm putting it on the sprocket side because that's the side that handles the highest load in a bicycle. Make sure that you fit it this way round, with the retainer fingers facing away from the bearing cone. Now we can refit the crank into the bicycle frame. And I'll turn the bike around again so that we can finish the job. Now we can hold the crank in place while we fit the second bearing. Then we can slide the bearing cone over the crank arm and tighten it to finger tight. You'll usually need to use a screwdriver to get the bearing cone to its final tightness. You want the crank to turn freely without any notchiness, but also to not have any side-to-side movement. Now we can refit the crank's lock washer, and finally we can refit the lock nut. Our last step is to tighten the lock nut with a big spanner. Sometimes doing this will over-tighten the bearing cone and make the crank stiff to rotate. If that happens, you just loosen the lock nut, then loosen the bearing cone slightly and try again. Now we can refit our left pedal. When you're tightening a pedal, it works best if you can arrange the crank and spanner like this. Then you can just push the spanner down without having to hold the opposite crank against it. Now we can turn the bike over and work on that rear wheel. I know I left it around here somewhere. We want to remove the inner tube, so first we'll unscrew the valve cap. When you're removing a tyre from its rim, it's best to start on the side away from the valve stem. I'll put our first tyre lever in position, then I'll move a little way around the rim and use our second one. Sometimes these small diameter wheels are a lot harder to deal with than big ones. I'll keep working around the rim until the tyre is loose enough to slip off, like this. Now we can push the valve stem through the hole in the rim. This is another step that can be difficult on a small diameter wheel. Now we can remove the inner tube. Next we'll pump some air into the tube and see where it's punctured. That has a fairly fast leak, but unfortunately it's very close to the valve stem. It's hard to get a patch to work in that location, and also the valve stem itself has started to pull out of the tube, so I'll just fit a whole new inner tube instead. A fully deflated inner tube is hard to fit properly into the rim, so we'll put a little bit of air into it first. I'll start by putting the valve stem through the hole in the rim. As I may have already mentioned, these small diameter wheels are often harder to work with than larger ones. Now we'll start from the valve stem and fit the tube evenly inside the rim and tyre. It's best to start fitting the tyre from the valve stem side to minimise our chances of tearing the valve stem out of the inner tube. When you get to the far side of the rim, you can usually pop the tyre in by pushing it with your thumbs. Now we can inflate the tyre to its recommended pressure. This tyre pump head is also a tricky fit on this tiny wheel. As I may have mentioned once or twice so far, small wheels and tyres are often harder to deal with than larger ones. Ride-on lawnmower wheels are absolutely the worst. Once our tyre is inflated, we can refit the wheel to the bike. I'll start by putting the chain back onto the crank sprocket. The chain needs to drape in this direction around the bicycle frame. Now we can push the wheel's axle into the frame's slots and refit the chain around the wheel sprocket. Now we'll go to the other side of the wheel and refit the brake arm into its bracket, but don't fully tighten the bolt yet. Now we can pull the wheel backwards until the chain's nice and tighten the axle nuts. Then we can finish tightening the brake arm bolt. Now we're ready to give the cranks and rear brake a test. That should be strong enough to stop a little bike like this one. We're on the home stretch now, so let's refit the chain guard. We've just got a couple of things left to do. The axle nuts on the front wheel have been fitted the wrong way round, so let's fix that. These ridges on the undersides of the nut are supposed to engage with these slots in the lock washer to help prevent the nut from unscrewing. It also looks like the front brake isn't working. The pads don't even touch the wheel rim when I squeeze the brake lever. There are two problems here. Firstly, the brake pads are fitted the wrong way round. Now the angle of the brake pad will match the angle of the wheel rim. I'll try to hold the pad in position while I tighten down its nut. Now the angles look better on both sides, but the brake still isn't squeezing the rim hard enough. We can fix that by reducing this gap, and we do that by pulling a bit more of the brake cable through this lock bolt. Let's give it a test and see if that made a difference. So that's Miss Lily's bike, all fixed and ready to go. If you've made it this far, I assume you've enjoyed this video, so please consider helping us out by leaving a like or a comment. That might influence the algorithm a little bit in our favour, and you know how we feel about the algorithm here at Tightwad Workshop.
Blessed be the algorithm.
That's all for now. Thanks for watching. Tightwad Workshop is filmed in front of a live studio audience.